What is this union budget and why is it such a big thing? A lot of excitement around it. Why so much? Does it happen in other countries as well?
The Indian system is a little unique in the sense that the finance minister, as one person, presents it on a particular day. There is a lot of secrecy around it. Finally, coming down to what is called as, intriguingly, a blue sheet. It's supposed to be a completely confidential document. Not even the finance minister can remove it outside of the North Block.
So when you look at the arc of India's budget history, some budgets really changed the country's direction. Where does this budget fit into the history of budgets?
Read the 1991 budget. India was on the cusp of defaulting. 47 tons of gold had to be shipped to London. Otherwise, no one would lend to India.
Where does money come from for the government? Where does it get spent?
21%, 21 paisa in the rupee of the overall government's inflows comes from personal income taxes alone.
Being in India at this point of time, we are calm in middle of a storm, it feels like, where geopolitically you have so many wars going on.
It spells stability, it spells continuity.
Today we are going to be covering the union budget, but not in its traditional form of commenting how good it is or not so good it is, but it is about understanding the macro of the union budget. My name is Anant Goenka, President FICCI and Vice Chairman RPG Group. This is FICCI's podcast where we demystify policy and business. I'm delighted to have with us Mr. Pranav Sayta, partner at Ernst & Young. He heads international taxation and transaction services at Ernst & Young and also heads the FICCI Taxation Committee. Today we are going to be covering the union budget, but not in its traditional form of commenting how good it is or not so good it is, but it is about understanding the macro of the union budget. What does it comprise of? What are the details? And how do we get a flavor of the overall picture of the union budget? A pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure talking to you here.
So, possibly to get started, would love to get a brief summary of what is this union budget and why is it such a big thing in India?
Excellent. So the union budget for the coming year. So the budget for financial year 26-27, which was presented on 1st February this month, is really the plan of the government's revenue expenditures, revenue likely incomes, and likely capital expenditures and capital receipts for the year 26-27. It essentially gives a full snapshot of what the government is budgeting for, projecting for, planning for the coming year, and it's proposed and presented by the finance minister to the parliament, as we all know, on the morning of 1st February. The capital expenditures typically mean all the expenditures on infrastructure projects, roads, railways and so on. The revenue expenditures comprise its expenses on government salaries, the expenses on defense and so on and so forth. And the revenues comprise, of course, tax receipts and non-tax receipts, typically direct as well as indirect taxes and other receipts, plus the borrowings and sale of capital assets and so on. So it's the entire projection of the financial statement as the government plans it to be for the financial year 26-27.
There's a lot of excitement or hustle and bustle and hoopla around it. Why so much? Does it happen in other countries as well, or why so much of excitement around this space?
Right. So first of all, the Indian system is a little unique in the sense that the finance minister, as one person, presents it on a particular day. There is a lot of secrecy around it, confidentiality around it. And once it comes up, it's a one person, 1 day, 1 hour event, so to say. 1 hour is maybe not exactly true, but it's a short event which impacts virtually everyone, because the expenditures that the government incurs, the sectors that it is particularly focusing on, and the businesses therefore it impacts, the taxes that it levies and proposes to collect, it impacts virtually every part of society. and it comes up as one bullet event. Unlike in many other countries where it's deliberated, proposed, it undergoes a complete change by the time it finally comes up as the final plan for the next year. Whereas in India, there's generally very few changes between the announcement and its finalization. So what gets announced really is something that impacts various parts of across the spectrum.
I didn't realize it was something which was unique to India. I did know that there was a lot more excitement here, but interesting to know that it is more unique that this excitement is relevant to India than other countries.
Right, true, very
Yeah.
true. India is unique in that sense. Yeah.
So who really prepares this, very comprehensive document? I've heard of a lot of symbolism of secrecy around it, and what is the briefcase or the khata that is carried by the finance minister. Can you share some insights on that?
Sure, sure. Interestingly, this has been a colonial legacy. So, to some extent, from the British rule time, it continues. And for a very long time, while the word budget is not, as I said, mentioned in the constitution, it comes from the French word bouget, and that essentially means a small pouch. And in India, at least, it used to be that the finance minister would walk into parliament with a leather briefcase from which he would remove papers and read out his budget speech and so on and so forth. Uh, Lately, from 2019 in particular, the trend was changed to a red color bahi khata, the traditional Indian ledger that we are aware of. And then in 2021, it was changed to, of course, the digital tablet from which the finance minister reads out, which also incidentally is wrapped in a red colored pouch, as we know.
Okay.
So that's the thing behind it. But the way it is prepared is also very interesting. The budget exercise starts almost 6 months prior to the actual budget presentation in February. So it starts in around August, 6 months prior to the budget. And virtually it starts with the finance ministry, which takes the initiative, calling for expenditure asks or estimates for the following year from various different ministries. So whether it is defense, whether it is home affairs, whether it is external affairs, whether it is railways, it asks for expenditure estimates from various ministries in the central government, all of which send their asks. They are all assimilated through the various ministers. There is also input sought from all kinds of and consultations with all kinds of stakeholders like agriculturists, farmer institutions, businesses like FICCI, associations of industry like FICCI, CII, ASSOCHAM, etc. It also involves seeking inputs from various states through the state finance and chief ministers of what their expectations are. It also involves consultations with various institutions within the government machinery like RBI for what the government borrowing program can be, how it should be, what is the likely take up, and so on and so forth. SEBI, for example, and so on. So it involves a very wide level of consultation with various different parts and stakeholders within the economy, finally coming down to what is called as, intriguingly, a blue sheet. The blue sheet captures virtually everything that finally is likely to enter the budget, both in terms of concepts and even the final numbers. It keeps getting, of course, loaded in, and it's supposed to be a completely confidential document. Not even the finance minister can remove it outside of the North Block. And there's a lot of confidentiality that is supposed to be associated with it, because any kind of leak can mean that people can manipulate, take advantage of something before it gets announced. And therefore, it's supposed to be extremely confidential. It's far more confidential than what we call the insider information under SEBI regulation and so on, because it really impacts anyone and everyone. Very seldom, interestingly, have there been any leaks whatsoever. Even in this year, there was a fear that something had leaked. The Press Information Bureau then finally clarified that no, that document which was on social media all over was completely fake, and nothing out of the budget documents has been leaked. So it's very interesting, but it's kept very strictly confidential. And by and large, that confidentiality has been well maintained in the Indian context, I would feel.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is also a Halwa ceremony that
Good.
what is the significance of that and why does that happen?
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So it's about a week before the budget being actually announced or presented in Parliament, that the finance minister symbolically actually stirs the kadai, and the halwa is served to all the maybe 60-70 participants who are actively involved in budget preparation. From that time, the symbolism is that it is hopefully a sweet budget for everyone.
Okay.
And it is felt to be so. And after that, everyone goes in complete quarantine, in the sense that they are not allowed to leave North Block till the presentation of the budget, and none of the papers leave and so on. So it's supposed to be very tight from then on. Whatever has been captured as the asks in the blue sheet, which is finally signed off by the Prime Minister, is then put together in a budget document and presented on 1st of February. So
this is
so that-
incredible.
that-
very,
yeah.
very fascinating and good
Yes.
to know. Yes. We see whatever we see in the news, but what's going on in the background? It's quite amazing.
It's a huge effort, yes, indeed.
So when did this whole tradition begin? Can you share with us a little bit about the history of the budget?
It's probably been more than 150 years. The first, so to say, beginning was in 1860 by a gentleman called James Wilson, who the British Queen at that time, Queen Victoria, had sent over to India to present and to ensure that the Indian finances are properly managed. Soon after the 1857 revolt, so to say, to manage the Indian finances much better, they were in a state of disarray. And since then it has continued in some form or shape. The first budget in the Indian post-independence Indian Parliament, so to say, happened after independence, of course, as early as November 47. The first financial plan was presented, and since then it has been a tradition every year to come up with this particular budget.
I've also heard about the timing of the budget having undergone change. It used to be there in the evenings, now it's in the mornings. Again, why a change? Why was it at a certain time?
Right. So, surprisingly, with all the changes that we have seen in the contents of the budget over so many years, the presentation has been by and large stable, but I agree there has been this change. So, from 1947 till as late as 1998, more than 50 years, it happened at the same time, 5 p.m. on the last date of February. But that 5 p.m. was set pre-independence, because for UK that was with a 4.5 hour difference or a 5.5 hour difference, it was 11:30 a.m., which was just right. But 5 p.m. in India, the budget presentation was obviously unnecessary, so much after independence, and therefore it was moved in 1999 by then Finance Minister Yashwant Sinha to 11 a.m., saying that that makes more sense now from an Indian context. That was one big change on the time. And then again it remained more or less static for another almost 18 years, till in 2017, the then Finance Minister, late Mr. Arun Jaitley, moved it to 1st of February, first day of February instead of the last date of February. At 11 a.m. the time continued. And the logic of that was that if the budget got presented on the last date of February, typically by the time the budget was passed and received the assent of the President, it became maybe April, May and so on, which mean the year had already started before the budget was finally approved. And therefore his feeling rightly was that why don't we present it on 1st of February, so that before end of March, hopefully we have the final budget plan before the year commences, which makes more sense.
There's also a lot of talk on the length of the budget speech. How long will it be? Will it be for so many hours? We've had Nirmala Sitharaman, Honorable FM, giving the 9th consecutive budget speech. Is it maybe the most number of speeches that that any finance minister has given, or any records like this, or the longest
sure.
budget speech? What Anything that strikes you or comes to your mind?
Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman's speech, 9th budget, is equaling the previous record of Mr. Chidambaram, but the all-time record is of Mr. Morarji Desai, I think, of 10 budgets, and next year if she presents it, it will equal that record. Indeed, her budget presentations have been continuous, and in that sense it's really unique and some kind of a record. But she will equal the all-time high next year if she presents the budget, hopefully for the next year as well. And in terms of length, there has been a big diversity, variation of the size of a speech. Mr. Manmohan Singh's speech in 1991, which was again a watershed budget, was in terms of words probably the longest speech, more than 18,650 words, so to say, a very, very long speech in terms of word count. In terms of the time taken, I think the current Finance Minister Sitharaman's speech of 2020 was pretty long, 2 hours 42 minutes is supposed to be some kind of a record. And you have the diversity where in 1977 Hirubai Patel's speech was as small as 800 words only. The
Fascinating.
Yes, absolutely fascinating.
Now, getting to the heart of the budget, you said that the budget is about revenues, expenditure,
Right.
where money comes in and where money goes out. Would love to understand a little bit about the core. Where does money come from for the government? Where does it get spent? We do have some understanding. Again, for me, the knowledge comes in a lot from what I've seen organically in the news, but some more deeper understanding would be very useful.
Sure. So, broadly, the government's revenues come from two sources, as would be clearly evident. One is revenues, primarily taxes, which in turn is direct and indirect tax, and other revenues which are typically from, say, dividends, from PSUs, fees, charges and so on. If we look at the government's revenues, almost 39% comes from direct taxes, of which almost 21%, 21 paisa in the rupee of the overall government's inflows comes from personal income taxes alone, which means individual income taxes, 21 paisa in a rupee. Almost 18%, 18 paisa in a rupee comes from corporate income taxes. So, the total income tax collections are about 39% out of the total government inflows of 100 or 1 rupee. There is also a lot of indirect taxes, as we know. GST alone accounts for almost 15 in a rupee, plus you have excise, customs, so on, which adds up to another 10 paisa in a rupee. So, about 25% comes from indirect taxes, 21 from income taxes personal, 18 from corporate income taxes, 15 from GST, about 10 from excise and customs, 6 plus 4. That still adds up, as you would see, to about 39 plus 25, which is about 64, 65. And then you have a large whole, part of which comes, as I said, from non-tax but still revenues, like dividends from various public sector, central public sector companies, charges and fees like telecom and so on and so forth. So, all of that adds up to another about 10, which adds up to about 74. And then there is still a whole of about 26, which comes mainly from government's borrowings during a particular year, 26-27. 24 bucks in 26-27 financial year will come from borrowings of the government, and about a couple of paisa out of the total 100 comes from sale of government's assets like disinvestments, monetization of other assets and so on. So, that is how the total inflows of the government kick in. Typically, the spending or the deployment of the government's revenues inflows happens into various parts. Again, it shares a lot with the states. So, almost 22 paisa in a rupee goes to the various states, and maybe we could discuss more of that as we go along, but that is a large item. About 11 is the defense spending, which is pretty large, And then there are various welfare measures of the government, various forms of government expenditures which add up to almost 70 paisa in a rupee, plus about 8 paisa in a rupee it spends on various schemes which it shares with the states. So 25 paisa in a rupee is various central government schemes, 17 is exclusively of the central government, 8 is shared with the states. And then there is a big interest component, almost 20 paisa in a rupee is spent towards interest because of the government debt. So that is how broadly the expenditures or deployment of funds happen. We call it incomes and expenses like for individuals or corporates or businesses, but the government typically follows a cash system by and large of accounting, which means it is actually receipts and payments more than incomes and expenses. So all the expenses towards capital expenditures are also expensed out, so to say, not
Right.
depreciated.
Right.
All the inflows including borrowings are regarded as receipts, so to say. So it is basically a receipts and payments or inflows and outflows, in inflows as well as deployment is what it typically means, and that is what the plan for financial year 26-27 broadly looks like in terms of percentages.
Right.
Yeah.
And you said the government also has some amount of borrowings. Where does the government borrow from?
A very, very interesting question indeed. The government borrows ultimately from you and me. So the government has its borrowings in the form of treasury bills, sometimes 10-year treasury bills or short term bills, but essentially the government bonds are issued and subscribed to or purchased by banks. Banks get monies from depositors like you and me, but banks have to keep a certain part of their deposits which they receive from all of us as government securities, because that ensures financial stability, bank is solvent and so on and so forth. They are most liquid. And then of course there are insurance companies, we pay premiums, they deposit in central government bonds, mutual funds, private individuals. A very small part nowadays, because of the latest developments, are also subscribed to by overseas institutions, pension funds and so on. But mostly it is Indian institutions and Indian citizens. Indian institutions could include employees provident fund organization, pension schemes and so on and so forth. So primarily it is citizens' money, either directly or through banks, EPFO and so on and so forth, insurance companies, mutual funds, which goes into government security subscription, which is what the government borrows from private individuals directly or indirectly in some form or shape, as well as of course businesses and companies.
Okay. And is this what fiscal deficit is, what they say, when your expenditure is higher than your what you earn or the government earns, and therefore that comprises of the fiscal deficit?
What exactly is the fiscal deficit? We could keep hearing this all the time. So yes, essentially deficit is what the government deploys, uses, spends, which exceeds its incomes and revenues. That is the fiscal deficit. So in our case we said 24 paisa in a rupee of the inflows come from borrowings. So while the expenses are 100, the revenues are only 76. So that 24 is really coming from borrowing, which is essentially the fiscal deficit of the government, because it is spending more than it is earning, it is making more payments than its receipts from revenue sources. So therefore balance receipts, you are right, come from borrowings, and that indeed is the fiscal deficit. It is also interesting that there is a concept of revenue deficit. And the revenue deficit is really the difference between the revenue incomes and the revenue expenditures. So one feels that a deficit is not always a great thing, but to the extent the deficit is required or the borrowing is required to finance capital expenditures, it is more excusable or tolerable. But a revenue deficit where the revenue expenditures of the government are more than the revenue incomes is a little more frowned upon. And the revenue deficit in our case is about 1.5% of GDP. It has been a little sticky, but it has been coming down. The fiscal deficit is about 4.3% of GDP. both numbers being for financial year 26-27.
Okay. And you said the capital investment is more excusable because it is used in building the future of the country, and maybe there's a return on that comes out or results in higher efficiency. Is that really the reason?
Yeah, because it's like when I borrow to meet my food bills or my holiday bills, maybe through credit card, that's not a great thing. But if I borrow to buy a house, that is more excusable because that builds an asset which obviously is going to be used for a very, very long time. And it in turn, when the government spends on infrastructure and CapEx, it helps, it really spurs the economy into motion and helps the economy grow because it creates jobs, it helps businesses to be able to perform more productively and efficiently, reduces costs of businesses because of the infrastructure that is now healthily available, and so on and so forth. So, CapEx is very healthy, and borrowing for CapEx normally is supposed to be a more acceptable thing rather than borrowing for meeting revenue expenditures.
Okay. There were a couple of other line items which I had in mind, which I'd like to understand was healthcare and education.
Right.
Where does that come in, and is that going up over time? Has that been coming down? Is it the center or the state that spends on this?
Right. A lot of the responsibilities in connection with education and health lie with the states. But although that expenditure might be in some sense revenue as well as CapEx, of course, depending on whether it's spent on building hospitals or whether it is spent on building schools, which is CapEx, versus spending on day-to-day salaries of teachers or of hospital staff and so on. But typically that is key because when a government spends on education, it is creating a very healthy human resource for the future, which helps build the government's revenues in terms of taxes for the future, because those very individuals are going to be employed, are going to do well, are going to ensure that the gross domestic product, the GDP, the economy grows, and so on and so forth. So, skilling of employees, future employees, meaning education and skilling, is an expenditure which really helps. It has been growing over a period of time, and even for financial year 26-27, if I recall right, it's close to almost 5% of the total government expenditures, which has kept on growing, and which is normally regarded as very important and healthy, because having educated, skilled, particularly with our demographic advantage, people in the country, helps in providing a workforce to industry for businesses to grow, also helps creating entrepreneurs, also helps ensuring that the population is healthy, so there is minimum downtime, and so on and so forth. So, those are supposed to be very accretive to the growth of the economy and a country's GDP.
So, on the receipts part, a lot of people don't get what is indirect tax and direct tax. Could you explain what is the difference between the two?
Right. So, direct tax typically is the tax that a person pays directly to the government. For example, income taxes, whether it is individuals paying to the government or businesses, companies paying to the government, that is paid directly by the taxpayer to the government, the person who bears the tax. On the other hand, indirect taxes are not paid by the person who bears the taxes directly to the government, but they enter the cost of goods or services, and the business which is supplying the goods or services actually adds it to the cost of the goods or services which the customer pays, and therefore as part of the goods or services lands up with the selling business, which in turn deposits the tax to the government. By and large, therefore, indirect taxes are like GST, excise, customs, which enter the cost of the goods or services which we buy or avail of as services, and the supplier of the goods or the provider of the services in turn pays over the tax included in the cost of the goods to the government. So, I indirectly bear it as the consumer or customer, but do not directly pay it over to the government. I pay it as the cost of price of goods or services to the supplier or the business which provides them. So, that is the real difference between direct taxes and indirect taxes. In India, the share of direct taxes has been steadily increasing, which is a real good thing. And unlike in the earlier phase till the 90s, I think share of indirect taxes was very high. now we have a high share of direct taxes in our total revenue collections, which is the signs of a maturing economy.
And is that because higher direct tax means you are paying a higher share based on your income? So if somebody is wealthy, you may say I'm paying more tax.
Correct.
Whereas in the case of indirect tax, everyone pays the same level of tax on a certain good. So to that extent, it is not as it is it it is not as well proportioned. Is that
Right,
the
that's
logic?
one of the reasons. But progressive taxation can happen both in direct and indirect. So progressive taxation is where the wealthy are asked to pay more tax. We have, for example, the slab rates of income tax, which keep on going up. For the highest slab, it is 30% plus surcharge and cess, which could go up to 39% or 42%. So that is progressive taxation. To some extent, it is there also in indirect taxes. So for example, you will pay much more GST, for example, on sin goods like cigarettes or on high-end cars and so on and so forth, but much less on foods or necessities and so on and so forth. So to that extent, that progressive nature of taxation is there in both, but still in case of direct taxes, it is direct and therefore far more visible, and you collect from a person who has earned the income and therefore is supposed to be a more mature form of taxation. And GST distorts to some extent competition, impacts businesses growth, level playing field, because you have imports coming in with which domestic manufacturers and suppliers of services have to compete. So typically it is felt that direct taxes is a more cleaner way of collecting taxes and keep a level playing field by not distorting the economy too much through indirect taxes.
And on the expenditure front, there is capital and there's revenue expenditure.
Sure.
How has that moved over time in India?
Oh, that has moved really well, I would feel, particularly in the last 10-12 years. The share of revenue expenditure in the total expenditure of the government has fallen by almost upwards of 10-12%. So for example, from 2013 to 26, the share of revenue expenditures in the total expenditure of the government has fallen in double digits. And even for financial year 26-27, it is likely to fall even more. So now out of the total expenditure that the government incurs, almost 23% is capital expenditure and 77% is revenue expenditure. But that is thanks to this big correction over the last few years from 2013 till now. It has really fallen quite steeply, which is a very good and healthy sign, because as I said, capital expenditure helps in building infrastructure. It has a multiplier effect, creates jobs, helps the economy become more productive and cost competitive in a global environment and so on. So CapEx is really welcome.
Let's move now to the next part of the discussion, which is on what is the impact of the budget on the economy. One of the big areas that the government has continuously focused on is CapEx. And every year we've seen a substantial increase. Why is that happening? And can you share a little bit of logic and sense behind that?
Right. So the government's focus has been to have a tempered, moderated revenue expenditure and very targeted without leakages. So what is happening now is that the revenue expenditure is, while it is having a huge impact in terms of welfare measures, schemes and so on and so forth of the government, it has kept a tight leash to ensure that the money through direct benefit transfers and so on goes to the right pockets and is not misused or leaked out. And therefore, with a much smaller revenue expenditure, it has really been able to achieve quite a lot. And the CapEx has been the major focus of the government, which means it has been spending on building infrastructure, whether it is roads, railways, ports, and so on and so forth, which has given a fillip logistics. So which has given a fillip to businesses because it crowds in investment from private businesses as well. So that really creates jobs, helps improve a competitiveness, productivity and so on. This year also, after several years of back-to-back significant increase in government capex, I am talking of central government of course here, even in this year the central government capex has increased by more than 1 lakh crore from last year's from 11.1 lakh crore in financial year 26 to almost 12.2 lakh crores, which is the budgeted number for financial year ended 27, which is almost an 11% increase. And this is over and above the central government support to the states for CapEx, which is almost 4.93 lakh crores in addition. So there is a big thrust on CapEx, which includes, it's starting to show in terms of better infrastructure in the economy. This year itself, it is talking of 7 new high-speed rail corridors being constructed for financial year 26-27, which is massive. Also, it is talking of dedicated freight corridors, which is also a very good thing, connecting east and south from Dankuni in the east to Surat in the west, which can really help reduce logistic cost for businesses tremendously. It's talking of giving a big fillip to the local inland waterways through the cargo promotion scheme, the coastal cargo promotion scheme, which again it is talking of 20 new national waterways, and over the next few years it is planning to increase the share of coastal waterways, inland waterways, from 6% to 12% in the domestic logistics and freight movement. It is talking of city economic regions to give a big boost to infrastructure and amenities in urban conglomerates, particular tier 2, tier 3 cities, and setting up these city economic regions, giving them 5,000 crores each over the next few years to improve the infrastructure and the amenities in urban areas, because urbanization can really help. Today, the agricultural sector has a very small share in GDP, but a huge proportion of the population depends on it. Urbanization, therefore, is the way most economies have moved, and India is moving that way as well. So that again is a big fillip. And then again, there are 5 university conglomerates that it is setting up, which is close to major industrial hubs, which helps supplying workforce to those industrial hubs and so on. So the government is focusing to a very large extent on CapEx and infrastructure build-up, which indeed hopefully should help bring in private sector investments as well. It is talking of support even to private sector by having a risk fund for private sector infrastructure investments to happen, by covering certain risks for the private sector as well. So a lot of focus in this budget as well, continuing on infrastructure and CapEx.
We are also seeing it in a big way in our businesses. The cost of business, doing business, has come down. Logistics, which used to be about 14% of our of CapEx cost, is now coming down to close to single digits.
That's so big.
Yeah, if you compare it to the rest of the developed world, it's at about 7%. So slowly, Indian competitiveness is increasing. We are finding benefits to businesses in terms of job creation, in terms of new business opportunities for railway sector, or you look at road building, EPC contractors, and overall quality of life goes up for people. So it makes India or our cities more livable as this infrastructure improves also. I think the CapEx benefit is really, really beneficial in multiple ways.
Sure. That's very nice in terms of, that's anecdotal proof of, that it's working. Excellent.
Absolutely. And I think that's why the use of multiplier effect of infrastructure is commonly used in the news or in business circles also.
Correct. Excellent. So it's working, which is great. Yeah.
They also say MSMEs are the backbone of Indian industry. Is this government doing enough, or has the budget done enough to address the needs of medium, small and micro enterprises?
I think so, and I would love to hear your thoughts as well on this. But the whole aspect of creating SME champions, because India is full of entrepreneurs, and a lot of the jobs that get created here are by the MSME sector. So really, that's something that is one of the things that the budget focuses on, by bringing in the whole aspect of SME champions and so on, focus on micro enterprises. I think even the focus on building the skill sets required through quasi-professionals being provided through ICAI, ICMA and the Company Secretary Institute, in having these kind of schemes for training people in tier 2, tier 3 and other towns that they have come up with in this budget, are all great steps. Particularly, I was very impressed with this fund for SME champions to be created, because I think that will really spur the excitement and enthusiasm amongst SMEs and MSMEs as well.
That's right. And I think really the value that comes is from a large corporate point of view, or many of your vendors are small corporates or MSMEs. And as they rise, then the value to you also comes up, and it becomes, in a way, our responsibility as large corporates to develop them, improve their quality, improve their delivery, improve their excellence in whatever they do. And that, along with the budget and government led initiatives, I think can uplift society and eventually the products that the customer is getting in terms of the quality of the product as well.
So true, because the whole ecosystem, vendor ecosystem,
Yeah.
is of MSMEs to the large corporates, and their output can increase dramatically. It shows up in their final product or service when the vendor ecosystem is doing much better. So true, very well said.
Going on to manufacturing, Make in India has been a pillar for this government. It's been a little bit over 10 years since Make in India was announced. This time also, we believe there's been some announcements of certain key sectors the government has focused on. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, and how is this mix?
Sure.
In your
So the
view?
government in this budget particularly has focused on certain sectors apart from the legacy industries. It has focused on semiconductors, which I think is going to be the future in many ways. It is focusing on IP and fortifying the entire supply chain for them. It is also focusing on electronics, which again India has done very well on in the last few years, thanks to the PLI scheme and so on. Then of course the whole supply chain and the rare earths geopolitical situation has resulted in the government really wanting to focus on that as well. And one big area where they are focusing on in this budget again is biopharma, where they seem to be having a large focus. India is already the pharmacy of the world, and that's where they feel the future lies. So that again is a big thrust area under this budget for the government as well.
That's right. And I think the government has done a very interesting job in identifying the 7 sectors that they've looked at. I believe some are, as you said, legacy, where they are high employment sectors such as apparel and leather and some of those. And some are future strategic sectors, which are semiconductors, biopharma, etc., where if we those are future high growth. So automatically, if we get onto that bandwagon, speed of growth will go up, because the wave is very much there for these sectors, and it is important for our strategic autonomy as well.
Absolutely. So it's a brilliant mix, a very nice balance between employment generation, continuing where our strengths are, and also trying to build new strengths in the new environment for the future. Absolutely.
That's right. That's right. On the slightly more complex side, which is the taxation side, without getting too complex, what are the big shifts that we are seeing on tax?
Right. So one is of course not within the budget, but as a precursor, as announced in last year's budget. During the year, the government came up with the new Income Tax Act. So the whole focus is on trying to make the law simple, which is almost half the size of the previous Income Tax Act. And it is talking of making it more clear, certain and stable. So that's, I think, a big thing. The entire shift on moving away from exemptions and holidays and keeping the law very simple, clear, certain and crisp, which is what it has done to try and reduce litigation and so on and so forth. So that is one big thrust. Within the budget itself, it has come up with very nice measures in certain areas to try and make life simpler from a day-to-day operational standpoint. So measures like the new safe harbor provisions are game changers. For example, India has been really a winner when it comes to IT sector. What the government has tried to do is to combine various different subfields within that sector, like knowledge process outsourcing, software development, GCCs, which really were the real thing that reduced our current account deficit over the last couple of years. R&D space. So they've combined all of these IT enabled sectors as well as IT sector into one common theme, and said that if the margins earned by the Indian entity is 15.5%, they are kosher. there is no further attribution of profit in India. That really we feel gives a big fillip to global enterprises wanting to set up their hubs, GCCs as well as R&D hubs, knowledge outsourcing hubs in India, software development centers in India. So, all the global capability centers can now get a big fillip, certainty, clarity, very little compliance required, and the threshold has also been increased from 300 to 2000 crores. So, an enterprise here, an Indian entity which is having a turnover top line of less than 2000 crores can opt for the safe harbor with a 15.5%, and that is a big drop, because earlier the safe harbor ranged from 17% to 24% depending on the sector. So, it is a big fillip in terms of simplification, providing clarity, certainty and minimal compliances. Then again it has come up with data centers, which is the new theme for the future, that there will be clarity and certainty till 2047. They have said data centers who are using the global services companies which are using India data centers will not be called upon to pay any further tax once the Indian entity is taxed up to 2047. This is the first time I am seeing a government budget giving something which is clear for the next 22 years. So, that is really a first, and it provides a great deal of certainty to businesses to invest in India in that space, which is really a lot of investments today globally are going into AI, data centers and so on. So, that is a big thing for the future. Similarly, they have come up with good schemes for small businesses as well. For example, the courier exemption cap has been removed from 10 lakh. So, domestic small manufacturer, boutique artisan entities, similarly direct to company brands which sell globally and can build global brands through courier entities now are not subject to that particular constraint. Similarly, SEZs as a one time measure are now allowed to sell domestically because of the whole tariff related stress that we went through. So, the government has been very focused in trying to give fillip to existing strengths that India has, like IT sector, or trying to build for the future like data centers, or trying to give targeted relief to small Indian entrepreneurs, D2C companies wanting to build global brands, or even companies which are stressed due to the latest geopolitics or tariff related issues. So, they have been very, very targeted and come up with really good measures, a good balanced budget, I would feel.
Okay. And along with that, as you said, a lot of focus on simplification, compliance,
Indeed.
just making life easier for foreign entities as well as Indian entities.
Absolutely.
Moving on to the next part, would love to understand a little bit about the institutions behind the budget. We hear a lot about, the economic survey that happened a few days before the budget, various other entities such as NITI, Aayog or Planning Commission. Would love to hear a little bit about that, but one is on the economic survey.
Right.
And it comes out a day before. Also, very interesting document this time I found particularly.
Right. So, the economic survey is like the government's performance and the economy's performance actually over the last year, and what can be expected from the economy in the coming days and maybe the following year. So, it is really an annual report card of the performance of the economy, and that really helps in terms of planning for the future as well. So, in that sense it is a precursor sometimes to the budget of what one can expect from the budget. It is purely an advisory kind of guidance kind of document. It is brought out by the chief economic advisor in the government. In that sense, he has a good 360-degree view of how the economy has been doing, whether it is in terms of inflation, GDP growth, in terms of current account deficits, in terms of exchange reserves, in terms of which sectors are doing well, not doing well, employment generation. So, it is a complete comprehensive document of the state of the Indian economy and how it has been doing more recently, particularly in the last 1 year. And it provides forward guidance of what could be done to further give a fillip to the economy or to reduce stress in areas where there is. So, it is in that sense a very good precursor to the budget, but it broadly is completely different from the budget exercise. It certainly, the chief economic advisor would have provided his inputs to what we said earlier out of the various stakeholders, but the budget exercise is quite independent in that sense, and nothing in the economic survey is binding on the budget making machinery of the government of India. Of course, they draw a lot of inspiration from it, but are not bound by it. Let me put it that way. Yeah.
And there's also the Finance Commission. And this year, I believe the 16th Finance Commission was also tabled along with the budget. What is the significance of the Finance Commission?
That's a very interesting one also. We were talking of deployment of government, central government's funds, monies, how it deploys it. And there we spoke of, a certain part, 22 paisa in the rupee, if you remember that number, went to the states.
Right.
So what the Finance Commission does, it's appointed by the president. Currently, Mr. Arvind Panagriya leads it, and it's appointed for a 5-year term. It's a constitutional body under Article 280 of the Constitution, and its task is very clearly set out. We have a federal system in India where we have the central government and the state governments, and there has to be a good relationship, so to say, which has to be fair on both. A lot of the taxes collected now go to the center, and the center passes on some part of the taxes to the state governments. So there is a devolution to the states, what is called as a vertical devolution. What part of the central government's revenues are shared by them or passed on by them to the state governments, which is the vertical devolution. What percentage goes to the states? This 16th Finance Commission, which so to say handed over its report sometime in November of 25, was tabled in Parliament alongside the budget documents, has recommended the number to stay at 0.41 in some sense. So it is stable. It was 0.41 under the 15th Finance Commission as well. That number continues. The vertical devolution of what goes to the states. The states were asking for more. In fact, 18 of 28 states had asked for 50, but that hasn't happened. It has stayed at 0.41, which is still 41% of the government's divisible pool. Then there is what is called as horizontal devolution, which means out of that 41% which devolves from the center to the states out of the divisible pool, how much goes to which state? And the government has a whole full-scale methodology. The Finance Commission comes up with how that horizontal devolution happens. So it has various criteria. Some of them are need-based. If a particular state's population size is a certain number, the area of the state, geographical area is of a certain number, the per capita GDP of the state versus the income of the state shows how much more need is there in the state to be able to ensure that there is more equality within India amongst the states and so on. This year, the Finance Commission has added a criteria called GDP growth and given it 10% weightage. So the Finance Commission uses various criteria and gives it certain weights of how that 41% which devolves from the center to the states in turn is allocated to various states. Those criteria and the weightages are what the central government uses while allocating from the divisible pool to the various states of the 41%, which, as I said, is the vertical devolution.
So just a question on that. Is it mathematical, or is there some subjectivity also that can come in? For example, we've heard a lot of focus on Northeast by the current government.
Right. So a large part of that is as per the Finance Commission's weightage is given. Right. Then of course there's some amount of leeway for the central government to give further allocations. But a large part of it is driven by the criteria that has been established, and the criteria are also very logical in some sense of how there is need based and also performance based, because increasingly now the central government is trying to say that apart from the need based thing, if you perform well, if your GDP is growing well, then we will probably give you a better allocation, so that it spurs that competitive federalism. So
in fact, first time I heard this time in the budget the word challenge mode being used continuously. So there will be money given if the onus is shown by the state, saying that okay, we are ready to take this on, we are ready to drive this, and then
Correct.
If you come out first, you get the money.
Correct. So rather than people wanting money and wanting to stay poor or not doing enough, the whole idea is please pour yourself into action and do more, and you will get better allocations in terms of the central schemes as well as in terms of the devolution, both.
What about the NITI Aayog? I remember 15 years ago it used to be called Planning Commission. Over time, the name has changed, but has the meaning behind and the work they do changed as well?
Oh, yes, there has been a very significant shift. So the planning commission was a super body, almost like a super cabinet. All the states, the chief ministers would present their plans to it, and that's how the planning commission would decide top down how the allocations would happen and so on. And therefore, in some sense, it was driving everything. The NITI Aayog, on the other hand, which started, I think the transition happened in 2014, is more an advisory body. It provides guidance, and it's a think tank more than anything else. So essentially, the NITI Aayog will only suggest things, but the final allocation exercise, as we said, is decided by the Finance Commission, which lays down the criteria and the percentage devolution and the weightages and so on, and the budget exercise which happens at the Finance Ministry. So essentially now it has moved more towards the Finance Commission plus the Budget Finance Minister exercise rather than the NITI Aayog, which is more like a think tank which provides advice. So that has been a significant shift since 2014. And I think it has been working quite well since then. We are trying to now say that no revenue based grants, for example. States have to meet their expenditures, and they can't run a huge deficit and expect the center to give them grants to meet their shortfall in revenues and so on and so forth. There is this whole thrust on, apart from need based, which is of course essential and a large part of the allocation because of equality being important, but also this thrust on how is the fiscal and tax effort, which was till last year. Now it's moved on to how is your GDP growth. So a 10% weightage to that. So I think there has been a major shift trying to spur the states to do better and reform themselves once this has kicked in. So there has been a significant shift indeed.
Oh, great. So this brings us to an end of this section, which gives us insight onto the role of the key institutions of the government, the economic survey, which gives us the state of the economy, the Finance Commission, which gives us insights into how the center allocates funds to the states and keeps some money in the center. And we have the NITI Aayog, which is the think tank of the government. So going on to the next section of really the bigger picture and what's next. So when you look at the arc of India's budget history, some budgets really changed the country's direction. Can you share a little insight into what those budgets are and where does this budget fit into the history of budgets?
Sure. So we've come a very long way over the last so many years since independence. And one real landmark budget was indeed the 1991 budget, when India was Dr. Manmohan Singh's budget. India was on the cusp of defaulting. It had foreign exchange reserves for just 2 weeks of imports. Other than absolute basic necessities, we just didn't have the money to import anything. So the finances were in a mess. And that's where in 1991, in fact, if we recall, 47 tons of gold had to be shipped to London. Otherwise, no one would lend to India. IMF, we had to approach, and we got a 2 billion plus dollar loan from IMF, which also required that we really reform in a major way. And what that budget really announced was very significant. It was path breaking in the sense that the license Raj was virtually dismantled. Tariffs were brought down majorly. Now, of course, they are back in the news thanks to Mr. Trump, but that was a budget where tariffs were brought down in India majorly. we saw very significant liberalization commence in terms of foreign direct investments into India, welcoming foreign capital and entrepreneurship, technology, and so on. So that was a budget which was a watershed one in some sense. Of course, it had to happen because of some force, because a crisis, so to say, induced us to reform in a major way. But India changed for the better since then, and slowly thereafter this reform has kept on progressing. So that indeed was one very major budget. There have been on the negative side poor budgets which have really increased taxes majorly and so on. For example, the 1973 one, which after the post war it was, the finances again were in a mess, but the path we took was increasing steeply taxes and so on, which never got us anywhere, as we all know. So the 2026 budget, if I were to look at it, is one which really consolidates the work that has been done over the last few years. It spells stability, it spells continuity in terms of once again focus on certain industries, bringing in newer industries and focusing on them as well. We are continuing with our path on fiscal consolidation, apart from the fact that fiscal deficit has once again been lowered despite all the cuts in direct taxes and GST that we saw during the year. Even then the fiscal deficit has been kept under a good leash, and all of this is happening while the government is ensuring that even the composition of the fiscal deficit, the quality of the fiscal deficit is improving. CapEx is constantly going up, infra push is going up, and therefore, as I see it, the thrust is on new tax law simplification, reduced compliances, trust-based governance, ensuring thrust on infrastructure and CapEx that improves productivity and competitiveness of Indian industry, ensuring that the macro is stable, and so on and so forth. So I think this is a great balanced budget, looks at everything in the right way, and I think it's a way forward budget, so to say.
No, great, absolutely. I think being in India at this point of time, we are a calm in middle of a storm, it feels like, where geopolitically you have so many wars going on, uncertainty, tariff changes. And in our case, there's been continuity in the budget, a fair amount of stability, fiscal consolidation, uh, continuous focus on certain sectors, manufacturing, urbanization. I think those are great positives that we've seen over the years.
Absolutely.
And that's been the advantage of having a stable policy and long-term view in terms of
Right.
our government as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. I think there are a couple of areas that do come to mind when we were to think of areas where we can do better. I think one that does come to mind is state versus center. I think the state center is working a lot on ease of doing business. You have the Jan Vishwas bill, you had the 4 labor codes that got announced, but I think some amount on how do we, the state responsibility of making life easy actually on the ground. That is an area that I'm not sure if the budget has to show that, because a lot is happening outside of the budget as well. But we are seeing some enthusiasm in some states, but not maybe across the board as well.
No, very, very well said. So the central government has been focused on reform and has been steadfast with its fiscal discipline, despite COVID and all of the others, and why we see several countries, being going a little haywire with their fiscal spending. India has been very responsible from the central government standpoint. Reforms have also been very positive and clear directional, simplicity, stability, trying to ensure that there's ease of doing business, reform, ease of living. Everything has been right in terms of what the government is trying to do at the central government level, but it has to also percolate across the country. Yeah, we are a large country, and state governments also are being spurred. Why that is not part of the union budget, obviously. I think the union budget is increasingly trying to see how they can incentivize states also to reform and to reward those states which are reforming, maintaining discipline at the fiscal state level. Fiscal prudence is being maintained. So the government is trying to see, for example, no grants for revenue deficits to states, giving a fillip to states which are performing well, even the central allocations which are going. There's a challenge, for example, the city economic regions. The challenge will be who will come up with the right kind of path for ensuring that they deserve the best in terms of these grants or central schemes spending. So the central government is trying to nudge states and trying to promote federal competitiveness among states, to see that by seeing other more successful states, these states which are lagging behind also are spurred into doing more. So I think that's what the central government is doing. Finally, a lot of areas, whether it is education, whether it is skilling, whether it is land, labor, and so on, it is up to the states also to reform. And if we look at this year's finance commission, some of the beneficiaries are states like Karnataka, Kerala, Gujarat, those who are doing well in terms of state governments who are more forward looking and reform oriented, are doing better. So the central government is doing its part in terms of allocations, in terms of ensuring that they nudge states to ensure fiscal discipline, reform quicker, faster, and better, and in areas which will ultimately benefit all of business, industry, and citizens, because finally that state level reform is what will translate into growth of the economy. In fact, even for municipal bonds of the smaller municipalities, they are saying for every 1,000 crore raised, we will provide 100 crore. So the central government through its budget is trying to ensure that at the grassroots, reform, development, and growth is passed on.
I'd say that if I were to highlight, really uh, one big takeaway from this budget, what comes to my mind is, or our conversation more than the budget, it is the complexity of the job at the center. I mean, I think I've developed a newfound appreciation of the challenges, the number of elements that go in terms of various reports, economic survey, institutional information that comes in, amount of areas where they have to focus on expenditure, revenue, divide between the states. I think it's an extremely complex exercise, and I'd say it's a newfound appreciation towards the job that the finance minister has to do. And I'd say I've never heard in the last 70 years that there's been a delay on the budget. It is always on time at 5 p.m. or at 11 a.m. And the finance minister doesn't have an excuse saying that, no, I need another day or two to be ready. So that's quite incredible, and a lot of respect to our government to make that happen on time.
True, indeed, indeed. Indeed, this year's budget is one that really should take India forward to the next level of growth. And I do feel this whole thrust on stability, continuity, they are trying to also bring about a mindset shift, is what I feel, right, through this whole focus on trust-based governance. Trust the taxpayer, trust that citizens will really come up and do the needful. The whole thrust on private consumption, infrastructure, manufacturing, ensuring that there is a very balanced approach, managing the fiscal well, the macroeconomics well. I think they have done a great overall job in a very complex Indian economy. So very, very true.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Sayta, for your time. It was a very insightful discussion. Personally, I learned a lot. It's given me a lot of context into what I've learned organically from news and newspapers, to really getting a comprehensive view of what is the role of every line item, as well as every institutional input into what really forms the budget. And I think I'll enjoy listening to the next budget a lot more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Members of FICCI and the larger audience, we hope you've enjoyed this podcast. We look forward to getting your feedback, as well as any recommendations for future topics that would be of interest to you. Thank you.
Thank you.